Yeah, my name is Chief Officer Lee Bowden. I'm an explosive ordnance disposal officer. And at HKIA, I was the EOD officer and section OIC for Combat Logistics Battalion 24 and the 24th MU. Yeah, it's a pretty standard East Coast MU deployment initially. So when we left the East Coast, we went initially to the United Kingdom. The idea was the ARG was going to link up with some other ships in the area for some at-sea exercises, and then the Marines from the MU were going to get an opportunity to go ashore and do some training there as well. So I had a team come off of the San Antonio to train with Charlie Company 1-8 in the UK, and then a team come off of the Iwo Jima to train ashore with Alpha Company 1-8 as well. From there, we went a little bit further north to Norway, did some at-sea exercises, and put some Marines ashore to train in Norway as well. And then from Norway, went down to Spain. The EWO had a port visit in Rota, Spain, mostly for Liberty, but I was able to coordinate some range time from EOD Mobile Unit 8, which is a Navy EOD unit in the area, and use their demo range to get after some live fire training for my section, combat engineers from 1-8, as well as some combat engineers from CLB 24. That kind of after Rota, Spain, the ARGMU kind of consolidated again and pushed through the Straits of Gibraltar to head east to the Med, and then consolidated in Greece for some port time there as well. Nah, I mean, not really relevant to what we were going to do in Afghanistan. And at that time, we didn't know we were going to Afghanistan either. But that live fire demo in training in Rota was pretty informative. We were able to plan the entire evolution from the ship with the help of the BUS-4 to lock on ammunition support from the local ASP. So to be able to turn 2 weeks of planning on ship into actual on the ground training in Rota was pretty impressive to see. My Marines work through that problem, the engineers work through the same problem. To get things briefed and approved. And then just the idea that the Marines are willing to give up 2 of their 4 days of liberty to training, I was very thankful for as well, because, I gave them that option. I said, like, hey, if you guys would rather have, liberty time, port time, we can do that. But if, we're not going to get many opportunities to put our hands on demo and actually train while we're out here. So I'd prefer to leverage it if we can. And they were fully on board to do so. Yeah, we had left the Med, got all the way into CENTCOM, done some training ashore in Saudi Arabia, had a port visit in Oman, and then finally had everybody consolidated in Kuwait. So we had been in Kuwait for a couple of weeks, I think, at that point, just doing some training off and on. Focused on the NEO, because that's why we had gone to Kuwait, was, the writing was on the wall that an evac might be needed, and the MU wanted to posture itself so that it could best support that mission. But it was night of August 12th. We had kind of got a text from the battalion staff saying, like, hey, we officers and staff NCOs need to link up tonight and talk through some things. And that's when we were told that one of the force packages was going to increase in readiness, and we start getting our gear ready. So the force package that was selected was mostly Alpha Company from 1-8, but it had 2 of my teams and myself included as well, and then some strap hangers from the MU command element. So we just started working through timelines to get our gear prepped, ammunition loaded, and buses loaded so that we could get to the airport that we'd be flying out of. There's an awful lot of operational planning teams that come together on a MU for various perspectives, whether that's within the command element or the BLT. And there were a few occasions in which some of the planners and leaders on the ship had kind of sat down and been like, hey, what would Afghanistan look like? How might we approach this if it's necessary? Because, we had kind of been keeping up with the news reports as well, and the intel reports. They were basically talking about, things were slowly starting to deteriorate. We didn't know at what pace, but as far as we were tracking, the purpose of pulling us into 5th Fleet was to support a NEO. So if that decision was made where we'd make that transition from 6th Fleet to 5th Fleet, we kind of knew that that's the mission we needed to be ready for, essentially. But yeah, as far back as May, I think we had an initial conversation, done a little bit of planning, and then that just slowly increased over time until we went in August. We left on the 13th, so I would say night of the 12th, and then we were staged with all of our gear 13th, loading buses 13th. and then eventually it landed in Kabul late on the 13th. Yeah, I mean, it was a quiet summer night. You just see the city lights, the outline of the mountains in the background. Pretty standard insert, from a lot of the other deployments I've done. We were hitting a relatively large air base. Isn't a lot going on. You get on your buses or you drag all your bags to your building, and then you go to bed for the night and figure out what the plan is for the next day. Yeah, I mean, it seemed like a standard base, right? So people were walking around, no kit on, just kind of going about their day, sitting at coffee shops. The chow line seemed normal. Each of my previous deployments, whenever we'd fly into a place like Leatherneck, it was the same sort of mentality, right? So large, secure airbase, a lot of freedom to kind of move around without any threat. That was the general consensus or the vibe, at least, on HKIA. Yeah, our first order of business was to look at the problem set from a force protection standpoint. So on the 14th, I went out with some of the other key leaders to look at each of the gates, look at them from what threats are out there, what threats might we encounter, depending on how we were going to use each of the gates, and then how might we improve the positions. One of the original plans had the entirety of the evacuation control center set up at Abbey Gate. It was a long road. There was a lot of Jersey barriers for protection and other engineering assets that we could put in place to increase the force protection. That plan ultimately didn't come to fruition, but we looked at each of the gates from a how do we protect the force at these. One of the primary threats that I was focused on before we went in, at least from a EOD perspective, was vehicle-borne IEDs. And each of the gates posed their own unique problem in that regard based on how they were set up, the engineering assets available to protect the force. And so I was mainly looking at hey, how might we reorganize some of these areas or put additional capabilities in place to push that VBID threat back and protect the force a little bit more. So that was mostly the 14th. Simultaneously, my EOD teams were getting a lay for the land and figure out where we might set up shop. So we were conducting a link up with the 319th EOD company out of the Washington National Guard, who had been there for better part of a year at that point. So we linked up with them. They brought us into their shop, cleared out some workspace for us. And that kind of started the joint EOD relationship on HKIA that we would see just flourish throughout the operation as well. Yeah, I think 14th and 15th, we still kind of thought, orderly departure was going to be the theme. Probably a little bit of uncertainty there, but things hadn't quite deteriorated around Afghanistan to the point where we were overly concerned. Even though some of the districts were being taken by the Taliban relatively quickly, Kabul at least seemed secure or secure enough that we'd be able to do the evac the way we had planned it initially. Yeah, I think the first inkling for us was embassy closing down shop, and that went extremely rapidly. So the day before, no talks about closing down the embassy, at least not from our perspective. And then the very next day, the 319th, they had two teams at the embassy, and they were hearing from their guys that they were pulling chocks very quickly. So they started working through getting them living in working space and receiving their two teams from the embassy. And those guys showed up pretty quickly as well. So the embassy closed very rapidly. I think that was our first sort of sign that things were deteriorating a bit quickly, a bit faster than we thought they would. And that we might need to prepare for something a little less orderly than what we had originally planned. Yeah, I mean, it started night of the 15th. There was they could see people coming through the south side of the airfield through the civilian terminal. Through the night, they were able to get them pushed off, but it just increased throughout the day on the 16th, from a few hundred to a few thousand. And that's where things got pretty dire, where the airfield was totally overrun. And we certainly didn't have enough folks to really push them back or hold them back either. Yeah, I wouldn't say duties shifted. It really just came down to individual efforts. So night of the 15th, I kept my teams kind of back. I didn't necessarily want to throw them into the fray on non-EOD related tasks until we could really get a feel for what they looked like. So that night we stood post, some of the Alamo posts at the Jock, vice going down to the airfield. But the next day, it was pretty clear to me that it was going to be an all hands on deck affair. We didn't have any known explosive threats or explosive hazards to deal with, so I was comfortable putting myself or some of the teams against that problem set of getting folks off of the airfield, given that we just didn't simply, the MU and the BLT didn't have enough people on the deck to really force that many civilians back in a meaningful way, or at least for long term. Yeah, we had kind of got into a good rotation. So the total lay of the land for EOD ended up being, I had myself and 4 of my EOD teams. The 319th had 4 EOD teams. And then the SP MAGTAF came in with 2 of their EOD teams as well. So at a certain point, I sat down with the company commander from the 319th and the sectional IC from SP MAGTAF, and we kind of came up with a game plan of how we were going to support all of the forces on HKIA. And what we really leaned into was to leverage the relationships that we had already built with the units we had been working with for a long time. So that kept my teams in support of the MU, and that so primarily 1-8, but also the ECC, the CLB had set up. SP MAGTAF remained in support of 2-1, and then the 319th covered down all of 82nd Airborne, as well as Task Force Polar Bear and some of the other Army units. We remained prepared to provide mutual support to one another. But the main idea was that should a 9-line or EOD request come in, we'd figure out who it was coming from, and if available, task a team that was associated with them. But if we needed to, we could task any EOD team essentially from the ad hoc joint EOD task force that we had set up. So at least for my teams, throughout each day, we kind of got into a battle rhythm of linking up in the morning. I'd sit in on the operations and intelligence brief in the Jock, and then come back to the EOD shop and kind of brief that to the guys, so that they had a clear picture of where the operation was going, and some of the main, commander's priorities and intent as well. In order to kind of leverage stamina and keep the teams from getting burnt out, we built a rotation plan. So each 24-hour period, we'd have one team as a primary response team. They remain at the EOD shop for that entire 24-hour period. So think kind of, how firefighters will do shifts, essentially, 1 day on, 3 days off kind of thing. And then we had identified we'd have a second team that was backup. So if that first team got tasked out, the second team would slide in behind them and be ready to respond. The other 2 teams are free to, support operations in a non-EOD way, take a rest day, or otherwise just kind of keep themselves, ready to go when their shift would come around. For those primary teams that are on duty, what we also found was there's a need for us to go around at each of the gates, at least for 1-8, and check their electronic countermeasures. So each unit had brought in, man-portable ECMs to jam radio-controlled IEDs. They had positioned those at each of the gates to reduce that particular threat, but they weren't well-versed in how to set those ECMs up, nor do they really have the bandwidth to keep the batteries charged, keep the batteries in them, and keep them operational. So we kind of took on that quality control responsibility, and the teams would rotate through each of the gates each day to check the ECMs for position, make sure they were positioned in a way that would cover all of our forces, as well as that they were operational and functioning properly as well. Beyond that, it was really just responding to requests for support, and it ranged from everything from a box of hand grenades in the amnesty box of the ECC, to possible IEDs in luggage or bags or thrown over walls in various parts of HKIA as well. So it kind of covered the full gamut of missions that EOD might support with a ground force. Yeah, BLT 1-8 was coming across vehicles, living spaces, and just general areas in which the ANA had abandoned some of their ordnance. And that was typically, stuff from machine guns and small arms up into RPGs as well. They would sometimes leave it in a nice, neat stack, which was nice. So we'd collect that stuff and store it for destruction later if we were able to. There's also just a lot of Connex boxes and storage areas that had small arms and munitions and stuff in it as well around HKIA. A lot of different agencies own real estate on HKIA, and they all had their own storage areas for munitions as well. And As HKIA, got more and more pilfered over time, that stuff would kind of come out of the woodworks and be brought to our attention. Yeah, we had built a plan and done some site surveys to figure out, where might we use as a local disposal area if we needed to do controlled debts. Authorization to do controlled debts wasn't given to us. So we had collected a lot of stuff over time. We had plans to destroy it in those conversations with the JTF of like, hey, where can we begin to destroy this stuff so that we're either not leaving it or not eating up cargo space trying to fly it out. But we were ultimately not given authorization to destroy any of the ordnance or ammo that we had collected. We had our own explosives that we had brought in, small arms as well. And so when we looked at like how much we had brought in, vice how much we were going to need, and then some of our site surveys involved some actual testing to see was it a viable option to do destruction or controlled debts. We were able to destroy a significant amount of our excess blasting caps. We were able to burn our C4 and do some small arms burns as well. So we tested and validated the process with our own ammunition while still leaving enough to make ourselves operational. But we weren't able to really affect anything that we weren't in absolute control over. I personally didn't. After site surveys on the 14th, I looked at the place that I needed to be to reduce the most amount of friction was going to be in the jock. That's where the most information flow was occurring. And I left a lot of the interaction with the gates up to the EOD teams. They had a stronger relationship established with each of those units anyways, and were able to affect them more operationally. But yeah, my place was mainly in the jock, just so that I could catch that info, process it, get it out to the teams, and they could have an effect on the battle space. I did go out to Abbey Gate the morning after the blast to do a post-blast analysis alongside of the EOD teams from the Special Purpose MAGTF. So it was a collective effort to kind of piece the blast back together and figure out exactly what had happened. I believe SP MAGTF EOD teams were doing the same or similar that what we were doing with 1-8 down at Abbey Gate with 2-1. They would have had the same ECM, man-portable ECM that 1-8 had at their positions. It wouldn't have made a difference in the case of Abbey Gate, though. It wasn't a radio-controlled IED as far as we knew. It was triggered by the suicide bomber himself. It took a little bit to piece it together. We weren't able to go the night that it occurred, so we went the next morning at first light. By that point, a lot of things had been cleaned up. All the casualties were out. All the kit was out that had been strewn about. And we had heard some eyewitness accounts up to that point as well, and that's often some of the problem with something like a post-blast analysis is, either validating or contradicting eyewitness accounts. So one of the accounts we had originally heard was that somebody saw a bag get tossed over the canal and then that bag detonated, but there wasn't any evidence from our perspective that was actually the case. So once we were actually able to get out there and see the lay of the land, look at things like blast patterns, frag patterns, and piece together where certain casualties were at the time of the blast, what we were able to determine was the suicide bomber was wearing approximately 20 pounds of military commercial grade explosives on his chest with an array of ball bearings a little bit larger than BBs. And he stepped up onto the ledge of the canal opposite from the gate, squared himself to the Marines on the opposite side and detonated the charge. We figured that out based off of what I would call a splash pattern on the wall and the chain link behind, which was likely the bomber's body being vaporized and pressed against the wall, and then the individual ball bearing impacts on the opposite canal wall, the chain link fence behind it in a vehicle that was parked back there as well. When we were really starting to get into the demil and cleanup process, the 319th had been told about some 250-pound bombs that were being stored in the Afghan Air Force side of the base. They were fused and ready to go. And so they had kind of built a plan to go out there and take the fuses out of the bombs, make them a little bit more difficult to use as they were designed. And so I sent one of my teams out there to help them as well. And that, 20 years of IEDs in Afghanistan. And what was impressive to me was towards the very end of it, we had EOD techs doing a very traditional EOD job, which was, defusing bombs. That's what brought us into existence in the 40s. And that's what we were doing at the end of Afghanistan as well. And the EOD techs, they were passionate about it. They saw the meaningfulness behind it. It wasn't the traditionally sexy work of IEDs that had brought a lot of those guys into the field, but it was EOD work at its truest sense as well. And they performed flawlessly throughout the entire operation with, everything from collecting hand grenades to, tackling possible IEDs as well. To the best of my knowledge, it was NSU and Charlie Company had some positions near one another. Either one or both of those positions took fire from outside of HKIA, in sort of the chaos of returning fire. NSU took some casualties. Our involvement was that they had RPGs and some other ordnance in that truck, and so once everything was clear, Charlie Company requested we come up and take control of the munitions. Yeah, I think the main concern was that any and every bag could be a potential device. And so they were very detailed in their searches at each of the gates. At times that produced, responses for my teams because they weren't sure what they were looking at, and were absolutely following procedures as they had been taught to execute. I say on the Marine side, ingenuity being what it is, a lot of different hand grenades had kind of been collected from various points. And so Marines trying to employ non-lethals in a way that was meaningful and impactful. At times they were using grenades that perhaps weren't in our inventory. And so we had to kind of pull that back at times as well and be like, hey, the particular grenade you guys are intending on using shouldn't be used in the proximity to the civilians that you're looking at using it, or it's not the type you think it is, sort of thing as well. So because of how much foreign ordnance, ammunitions and grenades were just kind of floating around, something we try to be cognizant of is the education side of it. So, before you pick up something and use it, part of what we wanted to give that Marine the power was knowledge of what it was and how to use it properly. Yeah. We did the ramp ceremony for the 13 that were killed. And then from there, it was really just retrograde. So we really started to wind down evacuations and processing through the ECC. We had all our gear packed and shipped out as well. And so it really came down to just reversing the personnel flow and getting everyone back to Kuwait. There were fewer and fewer evacuees on the camp. CLB-24 was processing Afghans all the way up until the moment that the last CLB Marine left, which I thought was pretty impressive. They started the operation, they ended it with processing of American citizens and Afghans as well. But yeah, things were starting to wind down. There were fewer and fewer people there, which was the intent. And things had just kind of died back down to a lull, at least on the camp itself. Yeah. I don't believe they reopened to process evacuees, but it was open for British were still flowing through from the Barron Hotel the morning that we went out to do post-blast. That's essentially where they had set up their ECC. So they were conducting their evacuation operations from the Barron Hotel. I'd have to really look at the map to tell you from Abbey Gate proper to the Barron Hotel was a road and a canal, a little bit of street to get down there as well. So it's not like you couldn't come out of the Barron Hotel and immediately walk into HKIA. I've tried to compartmentalize experiences quite a bit. I think it is meaningful and impactful, but what I have told a lot of Marines as I've interacted with them since HKIA is that 17 days for the evacuation to me isn't nearly as meaningful or as impactful, when you overlay that with a 18-year career in the Marine Corps and other deployments to Afghanistan, as it is to a Marine on his first enlistment and only deployment, right? So for me, it's another operation, that I've done. It's the last time I will probably go back to Afghanistan. But for our younger Marines, that's the one and only thing that they did in their career that was meaningful and impactful and combat related. and that is going to have a remarkably different effect on them for years to come than I would say it is somebody like myself. Yeah, I'm reminded of a scene for probably one of the greatest war movies ever made, Saving Private Ryan. The bridge scene where Captain John Miller is telling Private James Ryan that he needs to earn it. I think about that an awful lot with the 13, is that they and everyone else killed in OEF and OEF have given us an incredible gift. It's on us to earn that gift each and every day. More impactful from that movie, though, is when we see old Private Ryan back at the graveyard in front of Cap Miller's grave, and he tells him that he's thought about that day on the bridge every day since then. I don't want to be in that position 50 or 60 years from now, wondering if I've earned the gift that those 13 have given us, or every other Marine or service member, killed in Afghanistan or Iraq has given us as well. I don't think we'll ever be sure of that, though. And so the only thing we can really do is live a meaningful life, good citizens, good humans, and hope that it makes a difference when our time comes. Sergeant Nicole G was in CLB 24. Our section kind of worked with her off and on during the workup. She was an electronics maintenance Marine, and when we first got the electronic countermeasure systems, we were more well versed in them than a lot of the other Marines in CLB 24 or 18, but we still didn't know them inside and out. And we had kind of asked her to get into the technical manuals for them and bring us up to speed on how to use them most effectively. And she took that task on wholeheartedly. Gave my UD techs a lot of classes on them, and then she became a go-to on the ships for training on the systems as well. When we were doing a theater amphibious combat rehearsal or TACR in Saudi Arabia, we had 11 or so days of live fire UD training out there, and to kind of pay it forward, we had asked her to come out to the range with us if she wanted to just blow stuff up, which a lot of junior Marines don't really get an opportunity to do. And she was excited from start to finish, absolute, beaming with happiness to be out on the range with us. She was operating at such a high level as an NCO that, I tried to talk her into doing a line move in the UD at some point in the future, or at least explain the program to her so that she can make an educated decision on it herself. But we had a few interactions over our time in CLB 24, and, everything everybody says, about her demeanor, how good of a Marine she was, are all true. She was an absolute warrior, and a stud within the battalion, and made a huge impact in just a very short amount of time. Yeah, 100%. I mean, she was on the Iwo Jima with me and some of my techs as well, and ship life can be hard, especially for the junior Marines that are, sleeping in racks down in the berthing and eating on the mess decks. I don't think there was ever a point at which I saw, a glum look on her face. Even when everybody around her hated their life because they were stuck on the ship with, masks because of COVID, and the gym was shut down. Like, she somehow was still happy to be there, doing her job. And, that'll always stick with me, I think. Yeah. I mean, I'll brag on my UD techs for a little bit here, because, that was a phenomenal group of guys. Part of the nature of EOD teams operating in the way that we do is very disaggregated. So we might be an EOD section, that's myself and 12 enlisted EOD techs divided up into 6 teams. But, when actual work is going on, it's usually down to the 2-person team level. So for those guys to get a tasking with relatively little info, to load up on their truck and head out into, relative unknown to tackle a problem that, they've probably never actually tackled before, is pretty impressive. And that leadership comes from the competency and experience of the team leaders that I had, as well as the knowledge that their team members had to support them with. So really phenomenal EOD techs across the board. I was fortunate to have a section chief that was both wise and worldly. He was 10 years older than I was, but we both had experience in Afghanistan before and had complementary skills. And he very much had a rigid disciplinarian while also being a loving father approach to leadership with the techs. And then each of the team leaders had their own unique style of leading their team and how they interacted and led Marines from the units they supported as well. These were guys that had, a mix of experience in Afghanistan or not. But at the end of the day, regardless of how we had trained up until that point, every single one of them was itching to get into Afghanistan and make a difference. And they absolutely did so. I looked at my role as almost taking a step back. I've also used the analogy of, a soccer coach, vice a football coach, in that, once the match starts, there isn't much that a soccer coach can do to affect the gameplay other than maybe making some substitutions. And that's kind of my role as an OIC is to make them as prepared as possible during practice, during PTP, during the workup, during training, prepare them as much as I can for combat and EOD operations, because once we get into that, it's going to be entirely on them as EOD teams, and they latched onto that concept wholeheartedly, and made it a point to train themselves to a high degree, so that disaggregated from the rest of the section, disassociated from my leadership or the experience of the more senior guys in the section, they could execute and perform flawlessly. I'd recommend getting involved in nonprofits. There's a lot of organizations out there focused on assisting veterans, some specific to HKIA, and our Afghan allies as well. When I think about the mission of Operation Allies Refuge, it didn't really end, right? So even when we left Afghanistan, there's a lot of work to do with settling those Afghans elsewhere in the world, and in particular here in the States. And so I would look to your left and your right in, whatever community you might be in, and see if there's somebody that you can help, whether that's an American or Afghan, it doesn't really matter. The strength of our nation, I think, is in how we treat each other. And if we look at it from that perspective, that legacy of those that served in HKIA, that, non-combatant evacuation focus of getting citizens and civilians out continues each and every day around the country. Yeah, when I look back through how prepared were we as a section and as a MU for the NEO, I think we were as prepared as we could be, given the resources that were available at the time, right? I came to CLB 24 in the MU as a brand new warrant officer. I kind of cut my teeth on a SB MAGTF, leading the UD section out there. I attribute a lot of the successes that our section had to the years of relationship building with 1-8 and the MU. And so, if other junior leaders out there are looking at this, or, any other, getting tasked with being on a MU, I would say relationships are probably the most important thing you can do. Look to your left and your right, the other formations around you, figure out how you can support them, how they can support you, how you can be a part of the planning, regardless of your specialty or expertise, and look at it from a, one team, one fight perspective, because that's what it's going to be when push comes to shove.